We are now to the panel discussion. So I want to kick things off by thanking all of these people for not making me beg too hard to get them to participate. But we have such a good diversity of perspectives in the room. I thought it would be really helpful to run through some questions ahead of time, or that I had prepared ahead of time for all of them to maybe think through a little bit. But then also have the opportunity for anybody in the room to put their questions to the panel. And be able to pick their brains, and also, you know, everybody that's out in the room as well. And we have a large amount of expertise and different backgrounds here today. So, without further ado, I think we're going to kick off with the first question. I'm going to ask everybody to just please introduce yourself and share a little bit of your background with range management. We'll start with Barton down on the end.
Okay, well, you guys all know my name already. Like I said, I didn't say this, I don't think. I started with UW Extension in 2004, and originally was just kind of working in the basin, and then they added Fremont County to what I work with, and then, which doubled it, right? And then it's pretty much at least the western half of Wyoming. And a large part of what I work with is livestock producers, especially ones that have a federal lands component. We're able to have this opportunity to be here, and we're able to work for UW and to work with folks like you guys.
Kassie Camino, and I guess I got my range background. I grew up on a cattle operation over in Park County, married into a sheep operation, so that was kind of a pivotal switch. I got a range degree from Chadron State College, had the privilege to train underneath Chuck Butterfield. I worked for Grand Teton National Park for 2 seasons doing some invasive and revegetative work, which was an interesting location and spot. And then I was a range conservationist for the NRCS for about 13 years, and then recently made a career switch into ranch appraisal work. So thank you, Micah, for having us all.
So good afternoon. My name is Russell Burton. I'm from Pinedale, and I'm a range specialist with Y2 Consultants. I'm also the current Wyoming section of the Society for Range Management president. In my day job as a range wildlife and GIS specialist, previously I've worked with the BLM, I've worked with the Forest Service, I worked for a county weed and pest. That landed me with consulting. So I've worked in Western rangelands for about going on 15 years. And about a decade of that has been post-fire work with public land operators and permittees, primarily in northern Nevada. So very familiar with the post-fire landscape. And so, yeah, very, very grateful to be here and look forward to talking with y'all.
I'm Berrett. I'm a range specialist with the BLM here in Buffalo. I've spent most of my career as a range specialist. I've worked with Idaho Department of Lands, NRCS, BLM, and the Forest Service. I've worked with several agencies. I stepped into a district ranger role for a little while here in Buffalo and decided I liked working with producers best, and so I came back to be a range specialist and get to work with many on these fires. I've worked around all over the West through North Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, and Idaho and Wyoming. And I grew up, my dad was a ranch and feedlot, and I did a lot of pen riding at feedlots, so the livestock management is an important part of the range work that we do, and kind of understand that aspect as well.
Cool. I'm Jaycie Arndt. I'm a research scientist with the University of Wyoming, and just started a PhD program that's actually focused on some of the restoration work post-fire, so diving into that a little bit deeper. My background is a little bit more in the weed science, but still the range component. I've helped coordinate for the working group on invasive annual grasses, primarily managing Vetnata and Medusa head, but kind of working on all of that annual grass management. Some basic weed science of other species, and then restoration work from getting plants to establish to opening up that opportunity for plants to naturally recover. So a little bit of background there.
Thank you all. We're just going to go down these questions in order, so I'm not going to jump around too much on you. First question, how do you prioritize areas for recovery efforts following a wildfire? And I will say while you're thinking, not everybody has to respond to every question. So don't feel any pressure there. Some of this we've talked about already in our earlier sessions, so there's no need. If you feel like we've hit it already, maybe just a quick recap and then we can move on.
I would say, we hit on quite a bit of it while Brian was talking, just prioritizing areas where you know you have some potential of successful recovery. The way we've done some prioritization is having an idea of where those areas are and trying to estimate where we can have the best success. From a ranching background, I guess I forgot to include that. I also grew up on a sheep and cattle operation here in Johnson County. So putting that hat on, prioritizing areas where that livestock production can be impacted the most, I think is also important.
With that, working for the BLM, I know that many of you know your rangelands and what's out there better than anybody else. The BLM does have monitoring data. We've got across most of this and at least have one point on most of our allotments, if not more, with some actual data on the grasses that are out there and the sagebrush. We'll be using that as we try to determine what's likely to come back. If any of you want that data, it's available for you to use as well. So that's just something in identifying those areas that we were talking, that mid box there, what has perennial grasses and maybe had a lot of cheatgrass. That's the type of information we'll be looking at.
Yeah, and from the landscape ecology part and partnerships on our disturbed areas and public lands, of everybody has an idea of in the back of their mind of where they might spend their first dollar and their 10th dollar, and getting into that with the partnership team is to look at those resources on the ground. As Jaycie said, where's our stronghold for our resiliency on the landscape, and other key players on the ground, looking at wildlife resources, looking at range resources, engaging with producers, coming into a way that overlaps to find those priority areas, is critical, from my experience.
Yeah, I think the only thing I have to add, I guess, would be, fire doesn't recognize fence lines and ownership lines. So I think any time that you can talk to your neighbor, work across the fence and try to block up your treatment, block up your resources to make everything more efficient. I think that's a win-win for everybody's recovery efforts and dollars spent on the ground.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would agree. And then I would say that, I think a great example of a possible place to focus my efforts, would be those high impact areas. So like those bulldozer lines. I'm not saying that's for sure, but kind of those places where vegetative recovery natural recovery might be really slow. Or if there's places where we want to do something with a species that's not going to come back on its own, at least for decades, like some sagebrush.
Great, thanks. I'm going to pick on Thad a little bit with the next one since it's already been revealed that he can control the weather. We know the plant community response will depend a lot on spring precipitation. What do you envision to be the absolute worst case and best case scenarios regarding timing and amounts of precipitation?
Yeah, obviously we're watching this precip that we had through the fall, which was next to none for a long time. I'm hoping that somehow kept the cheatgrass from getting a start, so that maybe wasn't a bad thing. We've got this little bit of snow coming here, and it's coming and going as we're not getting large amounts, and it's melting off. Going into the spring, it'd be nice if we got some snow out there that could slowly melt into the ground, as it was mentioned earlier, that, steady precipitation instead of big flushes that just run off quick. And so we're going to hope for that to come in, the winter and the spring, and get those rains that just a consistent rain and the right temperature flux that's going to allow our perennials to come before the cheatgrass kind of gets a head start on it. Timing, I kind of had to ask around. I've worked mostly on the forest, and so looking down here, I'm thinking that March and April time frame is going to be pretty critical. Obviously by June, most years, a lot of your cool seasons down here are probably done growing. So just a steady rain starting in mid-March through April would be nice.
Other thoughts from anybody else?
So one thing we see in a lot of the country that I work is it's dry country, and it's sagebrush steppe, and a lot of the producers I work with, they recognize that it's pretty tough to have the perfect situation. You know, a lot of them talk about, you know, we might get the moisture that fills our dirt tanks up, or we might get the moisture that grows pretty good perennial grass. But the likelihood of those happening at the same time is, you know, not always consistent. And so we hope for the middle ground on that. And when we bring that into post-fire, you know, restoration work, you know, we're paying attention a little bit more to how those flushes of feed are maybe engaging with the landscape, but also looking at it of, you know, in those areas around those feed sources and on those more tougher hit country, those dozer lines can create erosional areas. And we start seeing rills and gullies coming off of dozer lines, something to pay attention to. We see rain on snow events. Be paying attention as a producer to your home ground and whatnot, at what's downhill of all that country if we get a rain on snow. And where do you have your stock? Where do you have, that's a little bit of preparation. So talk a little bit more on the, you know, the bad side of that, of what do we do is paying attention downhill from some of this.
I think if we have an opportunity to learn from previous fires, if I had a best case scenario, it would be to copy and paste the weather from 2023. Obviously a lot wetter around here, and it had that cool spring where your cool season grasses were a lot more productive throughout that year. So not only did we have the March, but if we could extend that precip into June and promote those, and then those cooler seasons that actually maybe slow down some of that invasive annual grass growth, so that our desirable species have a little bit better of a chance. And I mean, that's basically what happened with the TW fire, and there's pretty strong response in that area with that precipitation regime. But that's a lot to ask for when we had a record year precip. So
For me, especially for the fires out east of here, the worst case scenario is going to be dry. But when you get into the fires that were more up on the mountain, I think we normally want to like have a whole bunch of snowpack up there, but like was already said, if you get a whole bunch of snowpack up there and then rain or a quick thaw, and I think there's going to be some of that happens. Like when we were touring some of that fire, like some of that runoff or erosion, it's really only a matter of how bad is it going to be. Like some of it's going to happen, but a big snowpack with a quick warm up or a rain. Right? We always want snowpack and rain, right? But that's going to be a worst case scenario in those areas with steep topography and narrow draws.
Yeah, a lot of it's very context dependent. The topography, like you mentioned, is gonna influence the outcomes. We'll put it that way. Yeah. Barton, I know you mentioned this already a little bit, but what guidelines do you recommend for reintroducing grazing post-fire on rangelands?
Well, I'd really kind of get comfortable with being a little bit uncomfortable about it, but I say that because, I mean, the fire regimes differ quite a bit across the landscape, but a lot of our landscapes are going to recover quite well from fire, including with grazing. But I would really take the next couple years to up your management game. And the other thing that's important about that is not just the actual management on the ground, but if you have a public land component on your ranch, the next few years are absolutely the time to get to know your range con and your range staff. And I'm going to get a little bit touchy-feely with you, but if your attitude towards your public land agency is to stick your head in the sand and ignore them because you don't like them, you need to change it. You need to change it. This year is the time to change it. And even if you disagree with them, you still need to be talking to them. And, I'll just give one of the things I really like about Thad, and I've worked with him for a long time, is Thad and I can disagree about something, but we can still be professionals and work together. And we still, we largely have the same goals. And so no matter who your range con is, though, I would highly encourage you work well with them, even if it's not your favorite thing to do.
I would echo that, and I would just, it's been so hard to not get so doom and gloom, but I also think that we need to look at it as maybe it's a positive. The fire is a tool that Mother Nature uses, and so if we do this correctly and timely, and we all help each other through this, maybe, just maybe, there's some things that we can come out stronger for on the other side. But I think you got to keep your ear to the ground and, call in all of your resources that you have at your disposal, and just talk often.
Yeah, and these situations test every relationship, and it's going to come down and test every ounce of your management. It's going to test every relationship you have with your agency, with your neighbors, with your lender on the note. And this is when it's going to put a lot of that on the line. And this is when it comes down to, the rubber on the road of, I think it's really promising to me to see, we'll use it, the experience in the room and who's coming to the table to learn. Because, of the group, if Thad says, do you know, you need 3 deep-rooted perennial bunch grasses per square meter. Who knows what a deep-rooted perennial bunch grass is? And if you don't, there's the opportunity for you to learn about what that is, because that's a metric that stands between you and your livelihood. And this is that learning. Build that relationship. Learn about those things that stand in front. It's critical at this point in time.
Looking at the grazing guidelines, one of the first things that I did is I came into this position and got to thinking about the grazing that we'd be looking at next year. Was I looked at our resource management plan to see what was in there. Because some plans say you can't graze for 2 years on federal lands, BLM, Forest Service, whatever it might be. I was relieved to find that it did not have a blanket, you can't graze for 2 years. That provided the opportunity for us to work together. What it did say is you needed to defer livestock grazing until resource objectives are met. It didn't. We've got generalities for those resource objectives. There's nothing specific in there. So I think you asked earlier about the direct prescription. There is no direct prescription. And we've been trying to work with everybody individually, and we're talking across boundaries with all the agency folks and anybody that's knowledgeable on this. So we need the input from the people actually manage the livestock on the ground. But we've got opportunities to do those general guidelines to think about, boy, if we can defer it until after the growing season, that's optimally what we want. If we're going to go in and graze it the first year, then I think we want to graze it lightly so that we've got some residual out on the ground to catch the snow next winter, to help build some litter, but not too much litter. We don't want so much we're getting that cheatgrass. So, we've got objectives within the BLM. We've got 25 to 40% litter on some of these ESDs. We don't want 70% litter out there, but we do want some litter to help build those soils. And many, we don't build soil in this country very often, so we don't want to lose it. We don't want to get 1,000 years behind by losing a bunch of that soil. So we got to protect it. So those guidelines that we're looking for is try to defer outside of the growing season and put some litter back on the ground, get rid of that bare ground, but yet be flexible. If we have management opportunities where we have large cheatgrass infestation and I think I could go in and graze it and get out and take care of the perennials from the BLM standpoint, we'd have that conversation and see whether management's right to be able to do that. Obviously, we've got NRCS involved with some of the deferment payments, that sort of thing, but we can manage around that if we have that trust relationship and we know we can implement it the way it's intended, and it's not just, I have cheatgrass and therefore I want to graze all year long. That's not what's going to meet. It's, set up those objectives. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Can we manage it that way? If so, we do it, we monitor it, we meet it, and then we step back and see if we get the results that we want.
Yeah, that's still part of what I was going to say, but definitely making sure that logistically you're thinking about the fact that identity does matter. So lying out what your goals are, if that's to have perennial grasses for forage. If you're more interested in having sagebrush back, knowing that the biggest threat to sagebrush establishment is competition, maybe that means actually grazing a little bit more of those perennial grasses back so that you have an opportunity for some natural recruitment. And then especially with those annual grasses, we obviously didn't have a big flush of precipitation, so not a lot of annual grasses came up this fall. But there's opportunity that those could come up before your perennials early in the spring. So if you have an opportunity or the flexibility to get in there and graze some of those annual grasses early and cut them down while not impeding your perennial grass production for the year either. So making sure that you're setting those goals and knowing that depending on what your goal is, the species that you're aiming for can adjust things a little bit.
Thank you. The rest of the questions that I have on my list are looking more towards a long-term outlook. So before we move into that, I want to ask, does anyone have any questions related to immediate aftermath of the fire, recovery efforts, or what we're looking at like in this next 1 year type of period? Yeah, right here. And I'm going to repeat your question to make sure we get the audio.
Have you guys seen, after a big runoff event like our stock dams and stuff, have you seen toxicity in that water at all?
So question, is there any toxicity issues with runoff? Perfect.
I haven't necessarily seen it after, directly after a fire, but one of the things I'd be worried about, what I'd be looking at is from a water quality standpoint is, so if, you could have a nitrate issue, which would be sort of the same, well, it would be the same thing as nitrate poisoning, like from oats or something barley that was kochia that was high in nitrates. But from a livestock perspective, testing water quality is cheap and easy. And you can also buy testers that will detect, tell you what the total dissolved solids in the water are on a parts per million basis. So like if you bought your own, which you can buy them off of Amazon, and you were getting something like 3,000 or 3,500 parts or higher parts per million of total dissolved solids, that would be a time where you'd want to say, there may be an issue here. Let's take a sample of water and send it off to a lab that's can tell you in great detail about the water quality, and then we could look at alternate water sources or ways to make the water more suitable for livestock. And that really is not a bad thing to do, especially if you're using dirt tanks. That really isn't a bad thing to do, fire or no fire. When you look at livestock production, the higher quality of the water, the more they'll drink. The more they drink, the more they eat, the more they'll gain.
Other thoughts from the group?
Yeah, I'd overheard a conversation earlier in the day about using your feed lines and where you're putting them on the ground in the private land situation, but just remembering that post-fire, that infiltration rate of how water gets back into the ground changes, and doubling down on Barton. If understand that if you might be starting to get some fecal loading, you might see some algal blooms. Be really paying attention, on your private ground and public land wise. With that change in infiltration, you might see changes where you didn't, where in a different way than you would have expected it for the past generation. And that's just something that time in the saddle and time in the pickup.
Thanks.
Mike, if I can pop in here.
Yeah.
That is actually a problem we saw in Sheridan County. Trying to remember which fire it was. Badger Creek, yep. They had fire come through, a couple weeks later they had a heck of a rainstorm, all the ash went right into the ponds. I talked to 2 producers who had some yearlings get in there and all the yearlings died. So definitely take the time to get it tested if you're in doubt. Talked to a couple of vets in Sheridan County, Moxie's one of them, that's my cousin, so that's the way I went with them. But they said definitely they'd love to help you test it. But yeah, it is a problem and it's something we're seeing in the area, so. But granted, that one had about 6-8 inches of
Thank you, Courtney. Other questions?
Well, I guess during the winter, our fall, we kept seeing all of the windstorms blow all the ash. It's not just simply the water. I guess I'm curious as to what we're looking at in terms of its impact on soil conditions or regrowth, and the fact that there was topsoil in that whole area east of us was just kind of, you kept calling in fires because you thought it was fire, but it was just ash. But that was a lot of wind after, like in the fall, and I've been wondering what the regrowth or the impact of that is going to be.
Sure. So just to make sure I'm understanding, what's the impact of ash moving across this, or topsoil blowing?
Yeah, and it was, high volumes of it, so that's what the concern is what the impact. And not only just in the area where it burned, but where it lighted.
Sure. So ash translocation and effects on soil quality?
I don't have an answer to it, but that's high on my question that I want to observe next year, because I've got pictures and videos of the dirt drifts that look like snow drifts, on the lee side of hills and slopes and in the gullies. And I've observed and take photos where you got 3-4 inches of soil, which I've, also seen that there's a lot of seed as well has been transported with that. So you've got both removal of seed potentially in the topsoil where it blew off of, and then deposition of that. Now you're taking those upland plants and putting them in draws. And so I've done a lot of observation and plan to monitor that through the next couple of years to kind of see what happens because of that. I don't have an answer what I expect to happen. I guess my biggest concern is that we're losing some of the seed that was left. And where it's deposited, I would expect to see a flush of vegetation as long as it doesn't just wash down into the reservoirs. Is that going to be this vegetation you expect in those areas? But with that, we've done Z-dike structures across the landscape, and I've seen behind some of those actually a lot of that sediment deposition. And so even cattle trails in some other areas, there is potential to build your soil back up in those areas from what I'm seeing, if it doesn't get that big runoff event that's going to wash it out. And so maybe some restoration in areas yet top areas where it blows hard. I don't know, could be some impacts. Maybe it's not getting deep enough to have real negative impacts. I'm not sure.
All right, I'm going to move to our next question on the list and kind of combine that with the one after it. So in your opinion, how can public agencies and private landowners collaborate more effectively on wildfire recovery and prevention? Thinking more towards the future now.
I have a hard time thinking that we could do it more effectively. I think we've done pretty well at this point. The fact that all of us are in the room right now, FSA and NRCS, BLM, everybody's been, I think, pretty willing to work together. I think just keeping that communication open and making sure resources are available, whether that's education or funding, whichever one of those is best. But I think we've done a pretty good job at this point. Just making sure that continues on is important.
So myself as a public land manager, I appreciate the time and effort that I've had from each and every one of you. I've been able to visit. So I'm, as a range specialist, covering the Remington fire and the House Draw fire. Charlotte Darling's not here today. She's our other range specialist. She's covering the Flat Rock and Constitution fires. We've been trying to make phone calls and talk to as many people as we can, and then want to get out on the ground with you all next year. We've got a lot to learn from you, what's expected, what's going on out there, and then we're trying to meet our resource objectives out there. So just that open communication, making time to share with us, and we'll have our expectations, and we'll learn from you on what's going on out there. So just listening to each other. We want y'all to be able to stay in business and to be profitable and meet what you need based on your management, and everybody's in a different situation, whether you got cow calf, whether you got yearlings, everything else. And so we know you got management constraints. So just continue to talk about, what we need to hold to meet our resource objectives, what you all need out of the landscape. And sometimes they're going to line right up, and sometimes we're going to have conversations on how we can meet all that together. So just be willing to talk to us. We're going to listen and be able to change, the number 5 grazing practices that can improve range resilience. I think if you've been thinking about improving your rotational grazing or something like that, now is as good a time as any to really focus on that, because it's not gonna be just this year that we're thinking about things. It's gonna be year after year, and if you've got that pasture that you've typically grazed in the spring every single year, now is a great time to get that into rotation and not graze it in the spring every year, because I've seen it with sheep grazing on research stations where you graze in the spring every year and you graze in the fall every year, and there's not a wildflower in that spring graze pasture out there. And in that fall graze one, there's wildflowers everywhere. So it does impact what vegetation is going to be out there. If we can get some rotational grazing, graze it at different times of the year, that'll be one of the things year after year that'll help us 5 years, 10 years down the road, and not just really worrying about this year's forage and next year's forage. So.
Yeah, and this is an interesting question because of my day job as a consultant. You know, a lot of times I am the middleman. I am there to translate livestock production to an agency person. I'm there to, you know, work through some of that jargon and find that common vocabulary between, and this applies for extension folks as well, that, you know, most often we're brought in to be that middle person to help move those goals along. Yes, sometimes that comes because there might be a little bit of a rift in that social fabric from grandpa, from prior management, from whatever. And we come in there to maybe bring in some of the newer ideas, rest rotation, adjusting your time and timing, and duration and intensity, and finding a way to maybe propose some new ideas. You know, maybe there is the situation that, you know, the next generation has gone to school, they've seen some new things. How might we bring some new ideas to older range cons, to all of this, the share of knowledge, and we facilitate a lot of that. And those can really be, you know, good opportunities for if the fire was on you or on a neighbor, because you've now seen what's happening to your neighbor. And there might be that opportunity to incorporate those maybe some different tools or ideas of something as simple as having that mouth of that grazing animal in a different place at a different time every year. Bare bones. And adjusting some of those things. That's kind of, as a consultant, how we operate a lot, is bringing that over the fence idea to the table to try out new things and work through some difficulties for the future.
I don't know that I have anything too new to add. I just would echo, I can speak more to Johnson County just because that's where I was at when all of this fires hits. But I think that the job done already was really good. I think that local, state, federal, you know, folks at all levels were quick to jump in the ring and want to help each other. I think it just speaks to kind of the Wyoming way and the rancher way. Everybody wants to help. I think that we just need to continue that. And, you know, ranchers bring generational knowledge, which is awesome. We need that at the table. So we need you to step to the table and bring your generational knowledge. Agency folks have so many tools to kind of help work through this. None of us have done this before, thankfully, at this kind of landscape level. And so I think the more open communication we have with professional research-based knowledge and generational knowledge, and where we can bring those two together to just kind of diversify our toolbox, I think it's just going to make everybody stronger, hopefully.
Thank you. What indicators will you use to determine when a rangeland ecosystem has recovered sufficiently after a wildfire? What does that recovery look like on the ground?
So many of you that have some BLM land, I mean, we've sent a couple different letters at this time. I think everybody received the most recent one, but the general objectives we're looking at are the vegetative cover, plant composition, diversity, and bare ground, and litter. And again, there's no litter now in many of these areas, and what's the potential to get to that litter. And so we're not trying to set up numbers that you got to have this much vegetative cover, otherwise you can't graze. It's going to be loosely based on the ESDs that are out there. We're going to use some objectives that are set up, benchmarks that are within our ESDs, and then we're going to look at that type of information. So it's going to be a lot of on the ground monitoring, looking at those things and seeing if we're on track to meet those. You know, ideally, if you could graze small areas and meet the light grazing at different times and vary it based on how much annual grass, how much perennial grass, you could vary it across the landscape. But the indicators we're looking for are primarily that vegetative cover, bare ground, get a little bit of litter, either the potential for litter because you leave some when you do graze it after the growing season.
So I've been part of some post-fire releases, getting grazing back on the ground in northern Nevada. And a lot of the items that are on those agreements in that country that didn't, you know, that might not be a high priority for this area and the burn severity is your grazing management structures, your rangeland infrastructure. Is that back into a place that we can manage, you know, manage our grazing appropriately. That management has to, after a fire, that management has to mature just the same as that vegetation community does. And so is the management mentality in a way that can get back on the ground to incorporate some new ideas, these new potential, some practices that the agency has incorporated into the post-fire situation on the permit, cleaning out those dirt tanks, pipelines. You know, a lot of places. You know, there's places with above ground pipelines and solar features and items along those lines. So you know, that infrastructure is a huge thing of when it's ready, if the vegetation is there. I touched on, you know, items have been around with fire releases, and that comes down to that monitoring. If you can't manage what you don't monitor, and a lot of the ones we've been involved with are looking at 3 deep-rooted perennial bunch grasses per meter, and deep-rooted perennial bunch grasses being like blue bunch wheatgrass, not sandbrook bluegrass, and or a sprouting shrub or a shrub of some kind. And so that doubling down on that monitoring effort of if there's someone going monitoring, get in the truck with them.
I guess I just want to touch on that monitoring part is, you know, BLM, we're really ramping up what we plan to be monitor out here. We're working with UW and others to be planning to do some monitoring, and we'll be asking all of you to, you know, we'll be doing the monitoring on BLM, but working across the landscape, we'll be asking to monitor across the public and private lands. And I guess hopefully folks are willing to work with us, because what we're trying to get out of that is information on where do we need to treat. Some of that monitoring will be invasive annual grasses, the percent canopy, that sort of thing. So these are important parts to help in the management across the landscape, not just looking at our small BLM properties that are out there, but across the landscape, the things that we want to help you do. So definitely get involved, ask us questions, and hopefully work with us on getting that monitoring in place.
Well, I have a few more questions, but I know that you all took time out of your busy schedules to be here, and I really want to honor that. So if anyone has any questions for this group, are there any more out there that we want to get to? Everybody's thinking still. Okay, keep thinking. What practices can improve the long-term resilience of rangelands to future wildfires?
I think those practices that are promoting the type of vegetation that isn't going to burn as heavily. So trying to prevent some of those invasive annual grasses from coming back so that you don't have that fine fuel source. If that's herbicides, if that's grazing, any of those. Also, I mean, all of our desirable perennial grasses are one thing, but species that will stay greener longer throughout the season and hoping that those are going in. If you're looking at a reseeding practice, make sure that it's species that are maybe a little more resilient to fire or resistant to it. Could be my my initial thought on that.
I just might add that anytime you can diversify your operation, you'll be better off when a natural disaster hits, whether it be drought or fire or grasshoppers or hail or whatever. So I think we've hit on the grazing side heavily today, but I think too, anytime, like if there's a pasture out there that you wanted to cross fence or add water, anything that's going to lend you to better change up your operation, I think is a management tool.
One thing we deal with a lot in my work with permittees is that management paradigm of we still have a lot of operators out there that on any given day are going to choose to go haying over fixing fence or go haying over riding pastures. And when it comes down to what makes or breaks the operation, knowing the value of a day spent on the ground is a practice that is almost invaluable. And I have to remind a lot of producers a lot of times of if that operation cannot stand without that BLM permit, and you have management standards or indicators or whatever it might be that you need to hold to, choose how you spend that day. A day of education is pretty valuable, as we're all sitting right here. But how we spend our time after a situation like this is critical, and so great job for everybody here.
I know I already talked, but I thought of another one. As far as practice, weed management is very important. Whether that's keeping track of where you're feeding hay within the fire, knowing that some of the hay that came in is from different places that might have different weeds that we don't currently have. So monitoring those areas or keeping track where you're feeding, keeping it in a pretty low coverage area on the fire would be important. Also, prevention or early detection. There's Ventnata creeping down out of Sheridan County. It's already in Johnson County. One of the landowners in the fire has it on his property, just not within the fire. So that was a pretty big disturbance that now opens that area up for some possible invasion. So I would say especially keeping an eye out for some of those new species, whether that's invasive annual grasses or other weed species, and making sure that you get an early jump on those before they become widespread. And on that note, I brought an invasive grasses guide that's up here on the front table. If you want to keep an eye out for some of those species besides cheatgrass, because if you think cheatgrass is terrible, this table right here, Ventnata's worse. So
I'll get to some of the field days that you guys have, because it's really valuable to see that stuff in the field. These guys are very helpful, but seeing it out there, it really pops out to you once you've seen it out on the ground as well. So I'm guessing you'll have some of those again this summer.
yeah, we will, and surely in Johnson County. So we'll try to make sure those are sent out as well as we can.
Kind of depending on, again, where we are on the landscape, but especially when you get to the higher elevations. I think conifer tree encroachment, so that's maybe not such a factor east of here, but again, on the mountain, looking at conifer density, and either thinning or treatments, and looking at conifer encroachment would help, especially maybe not prevent fires, but when they are started, if you don't have a high density of conifers, you can reduce the severity and the intensity of a fire. So again, that's kind of more specific to the higher elevations, but even on the lower elevations, it can also have impacts, especially with your juniper species. But up on the mountain, I think that was a definite issue with the fire of too high density of trees.
All right, last opportunity. Anybody have a question? Oh, one in the back. Yep.
One of the concerns I'm hearing from Campbell County producers is what's going to happen with the coal seams and their potential for starting fires. Have you addressed that in Johnson County?
So potential for fires in and around coal seams.
So there's lots of conversation about that, both in, can they be put out, or, we have BLM, people are coming to us asking about that. And then the next thing is mapping and knowing what's out there. And so there is conversation in Johnson County about, can we get out and map with these fires that have gone through and maybe started some new coal seam fires. So identification and then the mitigation measure that comes out of it, removing the vegetation around these areas annually so that you don't have it spreading if something does start and come out of there. That's one way. Visiting with somebody today that was actually excavating the coal seam around those fires so that it can't burn out into other areas. I had not heard much about that before, so that's definitely something to ask more about. But yeah, definitely a lot higher on everybody's radar right now, the detection and what can we do to mitigate future fires from those areas.
Other questions? All right, I'm going to give you one more. It's not the last one on the list, but we'll use this one to wrap things up. What gives you hope about the situation with the wildfire impacts that we've had in the area, the impacts on our rangelands, our natural resources, our livelihoods in this part of the world? What gives you hope?
I guess I'll go first. I think from my personal experience, it's fostered new relationships that I didn't have before this emergency hit. So I thank you all for those.
I would say we're in the technological age, and in the post-fire landscape that's new to this side of the western rangelands. There's other areas that have tried some things, tried different treatments, and I know I've gotten a number of calls from folks in this area saying, hey, so-and-so wants to try this. I just want a gut check. And the ability to find and share information now and those lessons learned, I think from in my career so far in Nevada and Idaho, we're in a really good spot in this country of being able to share information and those lessons learned so we don't make the same mistakes twice, because that's insanity, right?
Yeah, kind of going off of that, I guess my hope for it is that the next time a fire happens, we're gonna have a lot more of these questions answered already. Maybe that's partially self-serving since I'm about to start a program researching post-fire recovery. But my hope is hopefully in the subsequent years, a lot of this, what's going to happen with perennial grass recovery, or what are the weeds going to do? What are these, the fire lines and everything? What's that response going to be? I think with as much land as we have to look at and work with, we're going to know a lot more in a couple years and be able to respond a lot faster.
I think I have, pretty good hope. Many of you have taken us out and shown us field tours where some previous fires have been, and there's been invasive annual grass treatment with some of these, some of them haven't, but there's good examples of the rangeland recovering pretty well, minus the sagebrush. I think that's a big concern, is how big of an area that we don't have that. But I think that the grass and the forbs and all that, we have a pretty good chance of having some nice recovery, and that things, as we monitor, may come back, and from a livestock production side, which most of you are involved in, that it might be pretty good a few years down the road. Mother Nature's gonna have the biggest role, and you all second biggest role, but that's the biggest hope. We might have to do some little things to help bring back the sagebrush, not just for sage grouse, but all the other species and the vegetative communities that rely on that different composition. But looks like we have pretty good chance of things coming out pretty well.
I think looking at my experience with previous fires and looking at the recovery from that is one of the big things that gives me hope. I mean, it's kind of hard to have hope right now when you look out on especially if you haven't been around a lot of burns and look out at the black. I mean, that kind of seems hopeless, but it's not. I mean, I have a lot of hope for it. I think the rangelands, obviously there are problems and invasive species, but I think the rangelands are in large part pretty resilient. The people that are on those rangelands are resilient, and you know, like I said earlier, we might disagree on some things, but we all have very similar goals and objectives. And given that, I think we can work together. And you know, even in cases where we lost a large part of the sagebrush, or some other species that don't resprout as well that are important, there's a flip side to it too, right? I mean, there's going to be additional herbaceous species of very high palatability in areas where the fire burned, not just in giant solid blocks, which I realize that did happen, but in areas where it, you know, so if you have a mosaic, those are important, and edges or between vegetation types are very important for wildlife species. I mean, for me, there's a lot of hope here, and I think even next year we're going to be sitting here thinking, yeah, I mean, things are better than we might have thought they would be, and in a couple of years, you know, 3 years down the road, it's going to be good. It's going to be a lot better than what we're looking at right now. And I realize there's still hard times to get through, especially the rest of this winter and spring. But on the long term, I have a lot of hope for those burned areas.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your time and expertise. Really, really, truly appreciate it. So let's give them a hand.